the international arms of these various departments, and certainly it starts with the Department of Education, but it's not just them. These international arms, many of which are in cahoots with Soros operations and other globalist operations all around the world, they're actually funding what they would call, what the left would refer to as affinity groups or like-minded organizations, those either in power, whether it's Western Europe and areas where they control, or possibly dissident opposition groups if it's areas that like Eastern Europe, where you typically see a lot more conservative control of governments. That's when they'll go and work with these other affinity groups. Benz, talk to me about some of the other departments that the Trump administration and particularly DOGE should look out for when it comes to this type of operation.
I think every single one. We just talked about the Department of Education. The Department of Labor is absolutely massive in this. I personally uncovered tens of millions of dollars of grants to the most anti-Trump, most anti-White House agenda unions in the world, especially the situation in Brazil and abroad in Europe. But on the Ukraine front, I've not done a mapping of how many of the teachers' organizations or how many of the unions in Ukraine are getting federal funding through the Department of Labor or through the Department of Education. But I suspect the amount is massive. If you want to pull up on screen, if it's helpful to look at, because there's an Atlanta Council piece from December 2020 called "Ukraine's Education Reforms Are at Risk of Politicization." And I
remember this. I actually remember when this came out.
Yeah. Now, I was at the State Department at the time, and I was a deputy assistant secretary in the cyber branch of the Economic Affairs Bureau, and so this was not directly my beat. But as a DAS, you get traffic that's not classified, but just to give you peripheral awareness of what other bureaus are doing and what issues are sensitive at the time. And at the time, I can tell you, the State Department was concerned that that Ukraine was going to try to become sovereign again in its education system. See, after we toppled the government in early 2014, and Senator Chris Murphy bragged about this. The Maine senator Democrat from Connecticut, who has been leading the charge to kill DOGE and to stop the shutdown of USAID and to stop the reforms of the intelligence services. He's on tape on live television bragging that the 2014 coup of the Yanukovych government in Ukraine, which was a democratically elected government, would not have happened without U.S. intervention. He said it only happened because of our sanctions and our pressure on the organization and our support for the people on the ground. I mean, that's a signed, sealed confession. I'm yours, so to speak. That this was a U.S. coup, and it's from the guy who's leading the effort 10 years later to save U.S. aid. So what does that tell you? But the fact is after the 2014 coup, we imposed mandatory reforms to the education system, to the teaching system inside of Ukraine, and this is stock standard. We effectively have a set of checklist items whenever we topple a government in order to reform it, which includes privatization of its national assets. We call this economic reform. We put the entire judicial system through a series of reforms so that they have no autonomy over their own judges and courts. We put them in the hands of independent bodies and independent associations. Of course, they're never independent. They're dependent on the U.S. government for funding and usually on the U.S. Embassy for direction on what to do. So we control the judges, we control the prosecutors. We typically control the unions through a combination of USAID, the National Endowment for Democracy, Solidarity Center, and the Department of Labor's International Affairs branch. But the Atlanta Council, I remember very vividly when this happened. The Ukrainians were forced after 2014 to transfer effective control over their own Ministry of Education to an EU governing body so that it would be free and clear of any sort of Russian influence. Now, mind you, this is 8 years before there was actually a war in Ukraine. but it was immediately post-coup. If folks remember, the New York Times reported immediately post-coup, I think one day after the 2014 government was deposed, the Central Intelligence Agency took effective control over the Ukrainian intelligence services. This was publicly reported by the New York Times. But the Atlantic Council's, this paper here from December 2020, and I remember getting recommendations about what to do. And one of the things that was recommended, and this was not recommended in-house at the State Department, I should say, it was an outside think tank, which proposed that if Ukraine's parliament went through and voted to take back sovereign control of their education system, that we could freeze their assets that were held in one of the Federal Reserve banks. I forget if it was the New York Federal Reserve Bank or the one in Atlanta. But the fact is the State Department was getting outside recommendations that we might want to seize their assets, threaten to seize the assets that they keep in U.S. banks if they simply get control over their own curriculum again. At the time, the State Department was fearful that Ukrainians were only motivated to take back control of their education system because they were unhappy with Western-style education. They were unhappy with the mandatory curriculum teachings on civic literacy that effectively purged their own history, that put a ban on the use of the Russian language while half of the country spoke Russian, that implemented all these reforms that the Ukrainians didn't like, and we have effectively strong-armed them in order to keep control over what's inside the minds of their little baby boys and girls.
And I was actually having a conversation with Joshua Lysek earlier today, the co-author of Unhumans, about all this. And we were talking about fourth-generation warfare, and these are all fourth-generation warfare tactics that were used against all the target populations that you're talking about. And I said something about, I said, well, fourth-generation warfare is so incredibly powerful. That's why it's so useful even here in the United States, like for elections and various things. And he said, yeah, fourth generation works right up until the point where someone decides to use third generation warfare back. And that's basically the start of the Ukraine war, where the Russians finally got to the point where they said, look, we believe we've been provoked enough. We believe that you are preparing to bring NATO into the country. Of course, they're talking about that right now with Keir Starmer. Apparently, King Charles sent some letter to President Trump about this, asking for British troops, and Macron is talking about bringing French troops into Ukraine. And this is exactly why the war started. So it stayed fourth generation warfare right up until the point where it went back to third.
Yeah. And the fact is, we could. I made a tweet about it a year ago, which said something like, this whole war could come to an end if the U.S. simply apologized for overthrowing the 2014 government, because that is what set the stage for this whole Ukraine affair. The fact is, the U.S. was very much treating Ukraine as a war state 8 years before the war. Trump was impeached in 2019 over even potentially vaguely threatening to withhold U.S. military aid to Ukraine. Why do we need U.S. military aid to Ukraine if there was no war in Ukraine? The fact is they were seizing back the territories in eastern Ukraine that had broken away from the Kiev government after the coup, that virtually the entirety of Western Ukraine spoke Russian, and the U.S. State Department imposed, through things like the Red Lines memo and direct pressure from the U.S. Embassy, as well as we're seeing in the educational reforms that were implemented, that they weren't even allowed to speak their own mother tongue. Half of the country was banned from speaking their native language. I mean, imagine the outrage, for example, if the government of Mexico organized a coup against Donald Trump. Half the country is Donald Trump supporters, and then the new installed president of the United States banned the English language and mandated everyone speak Spanish.
Right.
You're almost forced to take to the streets and protest. You're almost forced, if you're living in a state like Ohio or Pennsylvania, to defect from the union, because you're not even able to speak the new national language while you're already massively enraged at the coup you just watched take place.